Good afternoon. I just turned on all the lights. Wasn't that an extraordinary film? And the film that needed to be seen in this theater, with the image stretching from one side of the stage to the other. To talk about the film and to lead the Q&A, we have Dr. David Bordwell back again, and we have Dr. Richard Leskosky, whom many of you know as a film critic for the News Gazette and a retired professor in cinema studies from the University of Illinois. So, David and Richard.
Richard and I will talk a little bit between ourselves, and then of course we'll open it up for questions. And there will be mic wranglers around inside the cinema here for people to speak. A couple of things I wanted to say at the outset, but I didn't want to take up too much time, was a little bit on the production background of the film. Kinoshita wanted to make the film, and it was a very ambitious idea for him to do it in the way that you saw. And the studio that made the film, Shochiku, for whom Kinoshita had worked for many, many years, resisted because it was going to be a tremendously expensive film. But a movie he had made in 1957 called Great Joys, Small Sorrows had been such a huge success that he was able to leverage that to making this film. This is really a stupendous production. It may not quite seem that way, but it took up 8 sound stages. And it really immobilized all the other production on the Shochiku lot. It was really almost impossible to shoot another film because all of the crafts were being used to make these gigantic sets. In some cases, a week, 2 weeks or more to make a set that would only be used once for maybe 1 or 2 shots. So it was really a very lavish production, but Shochiku was persuaded to do it because Kinoshita was a very bankable director. This film was not, of course, as successful as some of his others had been, but it became a very important film in Japanese film history and was exported as well. It was seen abroad. So that's a little bit about the production. We can talk more if you want. But Richard, please, go ahead.
Well, as we're talking about it backstage, one thing that I noticed is that the subtitles were significantly different in some regards from the DVD that's available in this country from Criterion. And Nate just told us that this was a new remastering that actually came from Japan. So I guess we're probably amongst the first to see it in this country. One of the things I noticed in particular was that in the final moments, the last song that the miserable grandson and his wife are singing is not translated. And on the Criterion disc it is, and it's another song about dumping Granny on the mountainside. And then the wife, when she's talking to the husband, she says, "When we're 70, we too will go to the mountain." On the Criterion, interestingly enough, it says, "We'll go to the mountain together," which gives a different sentimental feel to it.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about the way the situation's presented is that it's partly for them that she goes up to the mountain, because not just because of the physical deprivation, the fact that there's a food shortage and obviously they can't eat as well if she's still there, but also the spiritual idea that the god will be angry. Kami will be angry, the Narayama god. It means oak mountain, Nara, Yama, will be angry if people don't obey this custom, if they aren't ritually brought up there. So she doesn't want to jeopardize her family's future by extending her stay or leaving too long. And she's, of course, counterpointed to old Mata, who wants to cling to life as long as he possibly can. So there's a way in which her resignation is counterpointed by his refusal. But again, his refusal is presented as a kind of stubbornness rather than anything kind of valiant or courageous. But it is definitely a double-barreled sacrifice for the good of the family's well-being, but also for that spiritual dimension as well.
And I wonder about the whole legend or myth of this abandonment of the elders, because given that veneration of ancestors is so important in Japanese culture, this would seem like the sort of greatest sacrilege to abandon your grandparents up there on the mountain.
I talked to an anthropologist colleague back in Madison, and he said that actually the legend that might have its basis actually in the sacrifice of children, for which there is actually some anthropological evidence that one folk custom in remote areas was, in fact, if there were times of trouble, the children could be sent up to the mountain. But that would be in harmony with what you would expect about the veneration of ancestors. But this is part of the controversy around the original story, because one way to read this story is as a very harsh criticism of Japanese traditions. In the story, as in the film, the village is not a cohesive unit. It's very divided. It's prejudiced. It really is very harsh towards Old Orin. And there's rivalry between families. There's, of course, the family that steals and hoards from all the others, but then their punishment is to have everything assembled and the entire family has to be killed. All these things are in the original story, and it's presented as a kind of real critique, I think, of the sentimentalized version of Japanese village life. Similarly with the parents issue, the idea that you could eventually persuade these old folks to gracefully give way to what is actually a pretty cruel ritual is something that the author, Fukusawa, seems to be wanting to bring out. And there are some interpretations of the story that see it as a critique of Japanese self-sacrifice during the war. I read one critique where the author said that actually what he's saying is, just as the old people were willing passively to sacrifice themselves just for the sake of tradition, so too did a lot of Japanese, particularly the young people who were kamikaze pilots, perfectly willing to go to their deaths for some ideal that is really not a very honorable one. So there's a way in which the film can be. The film is not an exact transcription of the story. There are differences with the story. But there's a way in which the film can be seen as picking up some of this idea of critiquing treatment of the family, treatment of the village with customs, and then submission to authority in a way that's kind of resonant with that.
I think it might be worth pointing out some of the references to Kabuki theater and some of the places where it diverges, because you hear about this being owing a lot to Kabuki, but there are some obvious things that are missing. For example, in Kabuki theater, you would have a special way of delivering your dialogue, special intonations. You'd have the actors wearing masks, and although the sets are very heavy, and makeup, and it would be significant in some ways. Now here we had significant lighting. Color changes.
But even there, Kabuki, traditional Kabuki is lit on a rather flat stage. It's a very brilliant stage, and these lighting changes that we get in the film aren't really characteristic of traditional Kabuki. As I understand it, though, there were innovations in Kabuki after World War II that pushed it in a more realistic or naturalistic direction, and it's possible that this is picking up some of those things, like the color-changing lights or the chiaroscuro. But the backdrop is definitely not a conventional Kabuki backdrop. It's a fake backdrop. It's theatrical for sure. But it's not like what you'd have in traditional Kabuki, which is very much like if you know those woodblock prints of someone like Hiroshige, it looks like that. These are somewhat more naturalistic. So to me, it's a film that exists in between. It references Kabuki. It points to it and says this is, it gives us little signs of the tradition. Like the chanter that opens it, like the whisking away, the play of the curtains as they pull away from the foreground, that kind of thing. Kind of parallel to some of the scene changes in Kabuki. But other things, as Richard says, like the acting style, only when the bad grandson comes in, there you get a real reference to Kabuki. That sort of stomping, stepping, swaggering movement. That's a gesture, I think, out of Kabuki. But most of it is much more naturalistic, much more cinematic, actually. So there's a way in which, this is kind of disrespectful, I think, to put it this way, but if you know that film by Mankiewicz, Guys and Dolls, which is it's very much like a theatrical piece, or even that much worse film, Little Abner, that musical. It's kind of played out on a stage, because the backgrounds are obviously fake and people are sometimes walking on treadmills and things, but it's also very cinematic because the camera goes into the space, we get close-ups and things like that. In a way, this is, to me, somewhat similar. It references Kabuki to give it a kind of gravity or solemnity, I think, and again, to anchor it in tradition, but it's not a very literal representation, I think, of Kabuki, for the most part. Yeah. One little reference I saw this time I thought I would tell you about because I didn't understand it when I first saw the film, and Richard points out it might be a little difference in the translations. Did you see that line towards the end when they're singing and talking about how she won't come back as a crab? There won't be any crabs coming out back from the mountain? Well, it turns out one variant of this legend is that if the old person doesn't die soon enough on the mountain, they come back as ghosts. And in fact, the No play that is based on this legend, the Zayami play, is a ghost play. It's about, she goes up from the play rather early and comes back as a ghost. So there's a reference to being haunted even if the ritual isn't properly, consummated.
There was another difference between the subtitles and the DVD and this. When the son is being told in confidence that, when you get to the Valley of the Seven Bends, you can turn back. On the DVD, I had the impression that you could turn back, but you have to leave Granny there. But here, it seemed more like you could come back with the grandparent. And
in the story, it's very explicit. It basically says it's permissible to leave it there, and I think that's partly because if it's a snowstorm or something, you can't make it all the way to the top. But yes, that's equivocal. That is, in fact, one of the changes that the Kinoshita version makes in the story. In the original story, Mata's son does, in struggling with him, push him over the cliff. But actually, he survives. He doesn't fall off the cliff himself, and the two men go back to the village together. So that seems to be a special part of this. The way looking at the film again, maybe you folks have a similar or different view. It seems like it's partly about the evolution of the son coming to accept the tradition, but then racked with remorse about having to fulfill the duty that he has in the tradition. Because he holds back quite a bit. It's that moment when they're sharing the food and the greedy Matsu is like sucking up all the beans, and everyone seems to agree, okay, time to go. And even he says, you should go up after the new year. So it seems like that's been his evolution towards accepting this ceremony. But then it's so horrible that he has to go through it. He's racked with guilt doing it.
But he breaks all the rules.
He does break the rules, which shows that it's kind of the hollow form, I guess, that he's obeying, and not the real substance of the spirit of it. Yeah, he's very racked by it. And I guess this reconciliation at the end that you pointed to, where he says, we'll go up there too someday, is kind of their resignation to this impossible situation. It's a fascinating film to see a second or third. This is my third time with it. And of course, as Nate mentioned, it's designed to be seen in a theater like this. And he wouldn't imagine seeing these extreme long shots that are much like a Kabuki theatrical set piece on a tiny little screen on your iPad or your iPhone or something. I mean, scale really matters in a lot of cinema. And here they really exploit it. It's interesting, this film would have been seen. There weren't that many theaters that showed scope back in the day in Japan, but eventually, Japan picked up widescreen rather late, 57. They start making their own films. And the theaters that had scope were mainly rebuilt for American films that were being imported into Japan. But then when they picked it up, virtually every director started to shoot in scope. And so they needed a lot more theaters. But indeed, the market was robust. People were still going to the movies in Japan, unlike in the United States, because TV hadn't really penetrated that far by 58 or 59. So there still was a big audience, and so they could afford to rebuild their theaters for wide images.
Yeah, well, and in fact, color wasn't
that
old either.
No, color wasn't that common either.
Kinoshita did the first color film in, what, 54,
I think, yeah.
Carmen Comes Home.
Fabulous movie, another one to check out. Really entertaining movie. Completely different from this. A woman comes back from Tokyo to her home village. She's been a stripper in Tokyo. And so her reputation precedes her. It's really quite a charming movie. Have we talked enough, Richard?
I don't know. I guess we could talk a little bit about the Ofuna flavor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The sort of sentimentality and emphasis on emotion and strong women characters.
Yeah.
That that were part of the, particularly the Shochiku productions. The head of Shochiku Studios believed that women have stronger feelings than men. And then the syllogism goes, art is based on emotion, movies are art, therefore women should like movies. And so they directed a lot of films towards a female audience. And Kinoshita fits right in there. I mean, he specialized in making this sort of, well, he made every kind of film, including ghost stories. Right. But this sort of sentimentality was consistent in his dramas and in his comedies. When he has tragic heroes, they're women, like Warren here.
Yeah, no, it's true. Shochiku was, the studio sort of divided the audience amongst them. Shochiku really aimed mostly, particularly the Ofuna, the Tokyo studio of Shochiku, aimed at a woman's audience from the 1920s on. And Ozu, it's interesting, Ozu's films are mostly made for, in conception anyway, for a female audience. And it's quite right that this Ofuna flavor is very much assuming that a woman's audience. By 58, it's probably not quite as strong as it had been in the pre-war period, but it's there for sure. And other studios like Toho and Toei and Daiei were much more oriented towards, they thought, towards action pictures, men's pictures, things like that. Are we ready?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, please. Some of you probably know a lot about Kabuki or Japanese culture, Japanese art. We'd welcome your comments.
I have a question for you, House Wright. House Wright.
That's over there.
I don't know anything about Japanese kabuki, Japanese culture. I had a question. When I saw the train at the end, suddenly I thought, oh, it's all an allegory about the old man, about tradition refusing to go off the stage, kicking and screaming, while the grandmother represents tradition, recognizing, yeah, we have to change and it's time for us to step aside and let the next generation take charge. And then when the guy comes back down the mountain, his obnoxious son, the grandson, is now sort of a family man, and it seems like a healthy situation instead of being the obnoxious grandson. Is that a valid reading or not? That's my question.
That's what I was getting at about the ambiguity of the film, or the openness of the film, because I think that's a legitimate way to take the film. That there is, maybe even in the grandson, there's a bit of a transformation there. I think in terms of the black and white ending you have, I think that's, again, you could spin that to be a kind of a critique of the audience. Like, if you think about the skiers that are there, and it's just another stop on the Japan Railway line, the idea that, you know, we forget what these legends and traditions are, and why even places have the names they have because of these things. And for us, they're just part of the past, and we can go up and ski on this mountain. But actually, it's rich in this somewhat complicated and maybe kind of sinister past. But I think you're right about it. Clearly, a lot of readings could be generated out of the idea that there is a tradition that people either accept with grieving, or refuse. And that seems crucial to the movie, I think. You're right.
And then, as I said, the song that's being sung at the end, which isn't translated here, is maybe not quite as mean as Granny has demon teeth, but it's you know, Granny's been dumped on the mountain. And for what it's worth, that particular station is on a spur, so it's not something that, it's sort of a dead end.
Well, also that's interesting, because you could even take the title as quite ironic. The Ballad of Narayama might seem to be a nice folk story or folk legend, you know, and it's actually this expression of very bitter envy on the part of the villagers for this woman who isn't aging properly. She's still too young. She still has all her teeth. And so there's a way in which the ballad isn't at all a romanticization of the village tradition in your hometown, but it's just suggesting how petty everybody was.
Except for Oren.
Yeah, oh no, she's the object of the scorn. Yeah, no, she's this kind of saintly figure in the film. But it's great the way we're introduced to her in this huge close-up as she's about to smash her teeth. The first time you see it, why? And then suddenly, of course, you see that she's been rehearsing this for a long time.
Yeah. And in case you didn't notice it, that's the the mill, the seed, or the beans get drowned on later on. Right.
Anything else?
In the aisle towards the back here.
Hi. Thank you for bringing this movie to us, Roger. And the casual references to the killing of the child, the great-grandchild to be, no, I'll bring it and desert it, no, I'll bring it and desert it, it seemed a little cold and casual. Was that intrinsic to the story, or was that added?
I'd have to check the original story. I don't recall it being in the story, but it is. It's part of this harshness. I mean, in one level, it's kind of naturalistic that we just have too many mouths to feed in the household now. But you're right. This sort of casual way it's done, I think, would be very shocking to a Japanese audience at that time. I don't think they would accept it as, oh, you know, just another tradition. That's a guess.
From the balcony. Up front in the balcony.
Oh, yes, yes. Okay, thank you.
I know the film is very specific to Japanese culture, but when I was watching it, I couldn't help but compare it to stories from other cultures, specifically the story about Abraham bringing Isaac up to the mountain. And I doubt the filmmakers did that intentionally because I know it's based off of Japanese folklore, but I was just wondering if either of you made that connection also.
No, it didn't occur to me, but sacrifice, you know, there's always, most of the cultures that I'm aware of do have these stories of sacrifice, of either the old for the young or the young for the old, and it does seem to be the general idea of going to the limits with a sacrifice seems to be somewhat cross-cultural. Yeah.
Center house, clear at the back of the room. Back here.
Yes, okay, I see you.
Oh, okay.
Hello, I just have a question about the remastering. It was so spectacular, and it was so consistent. I was just wondering two things. One is, were we watching a celluloid version from upstairs, or was this digital? And also, without having to get too technical, how did they recreate this in such a consistent, really highly clarified version?
I can't speak to this particular restoration, but of course now a lot of film libraries around the world, studios are remastering their films from 35 either original positive prints or from negatives and transferring them to digital quality. Either, typically they restore them at 4K now, 4K resolution. I actually have a few complaints about this version, but maybe it's because I sit so close, but I think that on the whole it was a pretty good remastering, and this is what we're going to see from now on. This is our future watching restored films, frankly. It'd be very rare to see a restored 35mm print nowadays. It's just the way it is, and it can be done less or better, and this is quite good, I think you're right. But it's going to be the way we see classics from now on, almost, unless you go to a film archive, unless you go to like MoMA, Museum of Art, or something like that. Yeah. If you go to Pacific Film Archive, they might show 35 prints. But even archives are remastering and copying their films to digital because they don't want to waste what is becoming increasingly precious 35mm viewing copies. To me, in my mind, there are pluses and minuses. For instance, I'll just be picking very quick. There are a lot of lateral camera movements in this film. And one of the things that people complain about, people like Peter Jackson, they complain is that there is the kind of a blurring in 35mm cinema, analog cinema. There's kind of blurring when you pan or track laterally. But I noticed here, what happens is that I have seen this film in 35mm years and years ago, and it's always struck me as a rather smooth set of camera movements. But here there was a kind of juddering, and it's almost as if the algorithm had to decide what was getting a bit of blur on edges that were moving laterally. Do I go this way or that way? Do I make the line here or do I make it there? And I noticed a kind of jumpiness in those lateral movements that I don't think you would have seen on film. Now somebody's going to say, that's why Sony invented 8K resolution. And I'm sure that, if Grover Crisp from Sony were here, he'd say, we can take care of that, no problem. But I do think that there are still some differences.
Okay, in the aisle, house left towards the back again.
Hi.
Here towards the middle there.
Oh, yes, I see.
Wave your hands and you can see. I sat through this movie thinking, Oh my God, that's not what I saw on my computer screen. Last year, my daughter said, you've got to see the Ballad of Narayama, so I tootled on down to That's for Entertainment, and I got it, and one evening I watched it. And there's obviously a black and white remake.
Well, there's a remake with Imamura film from 1953.
Yeah.
So you saw that version, the sexy version.
And this was an eye-opener, and I'm glad I've seen both now. But you want to tell us about the other one?
I haven't seen it since it came out, actually. I know, well, I can tell you, Kinoshita hated it. He said, the idea that they would make a pornographic film out of this story is, it's not pornographic.
What? It's much more violent.
It's Imamura really takes, if you think this is harsh on village life, Imamura takes it way farther. That's one of his thematic elements is the critique of Japanese village life. And it's brutal. It's really brutal. That's my memory of it. I haven't seen it. You've seen it more recently than I have. But yes, I mean, there would be a fascinating comparison because the story's available in English. We've got this version. We've got the Imamura. It would be a fascinating cross-comparison. By '83, you've got a director, Imamura, who's not part of the studio system, like Kinoshita. He's an independent director. He's very nonconformist, very angry young man, making a lot of films that are very critical of Japanese tradition and Japanese contemporary politics. So when he turns to this, he really lets go. Yeah, you're right.
In the balcony to your right.
Yes, I see you. Thank you.
In the story, is the son as much of a juvenile delinquent as he is in the film? And was there much comment about what reflection that gave on traditional Japanese village life and the mythologization of it?
Well, the grandson.
The grandson is pretty much the same in the story, I'd say. He's the most unfeeling. He's the one that wants to dump her immediately or as soon as possible. And I think that that's one of the controversial aspects of the original story, I believe, is that it's just as mordant and sarcastic about village life as the film. The film softens it, I think, about a little bit compared to the story. It's interesting that the writer himself got into big trouble with his next story, which was set in the imperial household. The emperor is actually a character in the story. And he even mentions the emperor going to the toilet. And this led to an enormous problem because it was published in a literary magazine. And the editor of the magazine, his household was attacked by a youth, a right-wing youth, who thought that this was like desecration of the emperor. In a way, it was desecration of the emperor. And killed the housemaid and wounded the editor of the magazine. So, and then the author went into seclusion, actually, went into hiding because of this. So it's very definitely, it's a firebrand original, in my view, from what I can tell from reading it and reading some commentary. And this is in a way more muted. Maybe that's another reason the Kabuki elements are there, to make it, kind of frame it and make it a little more distant.
To your left, midway up the aisle.
Thank you for using our bodies as your orientation.
Thank you. I don't know a lot about Kabuki. I've seen a Kabuki one drama and a Kano in Japan, but what I know about Kabuki comes from Kurosawa's Throne of Blood and reading a lot about it. And what struck me about this, seeing it for the first time, was not at all that it was critical, but that it was the Kabuki theme, as in Throne of Blood, of cycles of nature, generations of family, acceptance of that as both tragic and inevitable, and therefore the death of Oren, I mean, the son loved her, he didn't want to do it, but he did it for the future. So to me it seemed tragic, but not satirical, and I'm wondering if anyone else in the audience felt that way, or if you think that reading is possible.
I think it's somewhat possible. I think that I favor the harsher reading, I think, because of the characterization of the other characters. Everyone else is so unsympathetic, and the village is presented as driven to desperation by the lack of food, that there's a sense that it is necessary in a way, but it's also, no one seems to be as guilt-stricken about it as the son is. Nobody else seems to share, except of course the wife. Mata is in a way the most sympathetic because, you know, she It's that great echoing where after Orin has smashed out her teeth, she goes to the stream and wipes her mouth. And then twice, Amata goes out, almost as if to justify her tears, that she goes out and puts the water on her face so she can come back wiping it. So there's a way in which I think she's the most sympathetic to this, but she's rather passive, and she has to acknowledge it as well. I guess I would feel that the tragic dimension is there, but I don't think it's quite as salient as the criticism, to me anyway. But I think it's a valid reading, and that's why I said at the outset it can be taken from different perspectives.
Well, it's all three sympathetic characters really, except that, however, it's mocking the younger generation is they deserve. Usually it's theirs.
Yeah, I mean, the response is that the three sympathetic characters all submit to this because it's necessary to perpetuate and keep the future going. Yeah, that's true. That's definitely true.
There are also the older generations, the oldest and then
the elder son and his wife is just older than the younger woman, Matsu. Yeah, it's true. It certainly could be read that way. And in fact, often I think these things are kind of constitutively ambiguous because if it were obviously a very, very harsh critique, probably it would have gotten more negative response than if there's a little room to read it from another angle, like what you're suggesting. Well, it's interesting you mentioned Throne of Blood because that has much more Kabuki influenced acting than this does. That really is a transportation of a lot of Kabuki gesture and expression and pacing and rhythm to the film medium than this. Yeah.
You can also see this as the son not necessarily agreeing to go along with tradition as obeying his mother and honoring her wishes. She's the one who's the real traditionalist there. And so he goes along with it even though he desperately doesn't want to, because that's what she wants, and she's very adamant about it.
There's also, I think, a connection between, one of the things that I wondered about the second time I saw it was, why do we get to the messenger at the beginning? Why do we begin with the messenger coming? Why don't we start with the family? And it occurred to me, seeing it this time, maybe you don't buy this, is that this is a movie about walking, in a way. And it starts with him walking very happily into the village, He's quite cheerful, the Jiro Tono character, the messenger. And it's only later that we get all these rehearsals for the son taking Orin up to the mountain. He takes, when she comes to the graveyard and tells him she's got a wife for him, he carries her back. He carries the sticks, the rice sheaves, and so on. So we get these kind of preparations for him doing it, but in a more domestic or natural way. So that kind of these echoing gestures prepare us, I think, for this fantastic 21-minute sequence, okay? From the moment the music starts and he steps out with her on his back, the moment he returns and hears the other song, 21 minutes of walking, basically.
Here in the middle, towards the front.
Yes.
Oh, right. I really like this film. But the iconography of tragic transfiguration, when she's huddled and the snow is coming down, and there's a beatification of some sort taking place. And then the dark, stark scene of the elders in the cave and the lighting there. The witches in Macbeth. And it sort of rivals its impact. Something like a Max von Sydow playing chess with death on the beach. I'm not sure where I'm going with this.
No, I hear you. I think that's right. First, that scene when they bring the elders in and say, "Tell us the rules."
Yeah.
Remind us of the rules. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's a fantastic scene, and the pacing is unbelievable in that scene, and that layout is very Kabuki-like. That is the kind of thing that you would find on a Kabuki stage, and you wouldn't have even the mother and the son angled the right angles like they would. They'd probably be horizontal as well. But you're right. I mean, there's a sense in which that is a very sinister scene. I read it as the dead hand of tradition. You have to do this, and it can be done a certain way, and the way they pass the rice wine jug in two movements. Everyone move it a little. First one moves it a little, and then moves it again a little more. That sort of thing. I mean, to me, there's a sense of kind of fossilized tradition about that scene. Like everything has to be done the proper way.
One thing that still insist with me about that scene is the last two people didn't say anything. Yeah. And
one's a woman.
One's a woman, yeah. And I can't figure out if that means anything or not.
I don't know, I can't interpret that. Don't know.
On your left in the aisle, halfway up.
My question is, David, you had mentioned at the beginning that this was a late addition to the schedule for the festival. And both in watching the film and listening to the discussion, I keep finding myself thinking about Roger and about his being 70 and about the tension in the film between this sort of rage against the light on one side and this acceptance and grace on the other side. And I wondered if you think there's any possibility that there's, kind of a message for us in the selection of this film, the addition of this film, kind of at the last minute to the schedule.
All I can tell you is I had the same thought. I can't really say more than that, but it's certainly not implausible. I don't know what you think.
Well, that occurred to me too. As soon as I saw the sort of 70, that's the significant number in the film. Yeah.
Your point's very valid, but I can't really go further. Probably he wants us to think about that too.
Okay, in the back by the aisle, towards the center again.
It seems like sacrifice, self-sacrifice, and ritual suicide is such an important element of Japanese culture, and I just had a historical and cultural question, and since you guys seem to be so knowledgeable, what was the conception of afterlife, spirit life, reincarnation that would have been predominant in a society like that in the village at that time?
Well, it's essentially a Shinto frame of reference, I think. We might be inclined to see a Buddhist side to it in terms of transcendence, but it's basically the mountain is inhabited by gods, and you have to placate them. And beyond that, the Shinto is a kind of a folk mystique. Basically, catch as catch can. It doesn't seem to have, from my point of view, very many strict doctrines. I think it's material for the film to be, for the original story in the film to be expanded outward to a secular society, because it's aiming at a modern Japanese, the 1958 people, in towns and cities. I'm no expert on Shinto, but my sense is that this is a film that's really looking somewhat critically, or at least moderately critically, at these kinds of views and taking them as artistic material for the elaboration of these ideas. But the audience would certainly be attuned to these, because one of the striking things about Japanese urban culture is that it often turns its back on the village traditions. Many people would have come from the countryside, and a continuous influx since the end of the 19th century. So people were not that far away in some cases from folk traditions, but in most urban popular culture, those are all pretty much put aside or mocked. And I think there's a sense in which the film is simply using them for material to make a more broad secular point. That would be my take on it, but I'm not an expert on Japanese religion.
Nor I.
What I mean is, as a Japanese audience at the time reading the film, narratively, would the mother that goes up the mountain in the end, was there some kind of reading where there's some sort of beatific, some light at the end where there's something that some level of happy ending? Is there a way of understanding that by adhering to the traditions and going up the mountain and doing all that, there's actually sort of a little gold at the end of the rainbow, or is it just you evaporate?
Well, she certainly appears beatific in the scene where she's there under the blanket in the snow waving the sun off. But she is surrounded by skeletons and carrion birds. So it's
a really interesting point, because there's where the star system comes into play, I think. Kineto Tanaka is one of the great stars of Japanese cinema. She's absolutely at the top. Everybody knows her. And her role as a suffering mother, as she got older, she began by playing young girls. And then as she grew older, she played mothers. And if you know that Mizoguchi film, Sancho the Bailiff, Sancho Dayu, one of the 3 greatest films ever made, in my opinion. She's in a somewhat similar role, but that's a much more brutal film than this. And I can't but believe that there is something of what you say in this transfiguration just because she's playing the role. And she's playing it with this kind of sweet, simple sincerity that does lend this a kind of purity at the end. Yeah, I don't rule that out. I think it's the case where the social critique that might be in the film is somewhat counterbalanced by this kind of, as you say, redemption.
That'll be all the time we have for questions this afternoon.
Okay, fair enough.